Hey, welcome back. We're continuing to talk about Louise Erdrich's Love Medicine. And now that we've gotten a little bit farther into the book, namely chapters 2 and 3, I wanted to bring up another issue that is incredibly important to this book, and that is narrative. I'd like to continue our discussion of narrative as we go throughout the book, but I wanted to note the effect of the shifting perspectives early on. Chapter 1 opened with a connection to June, but shortly after that she was dead, and we shifted to the rest of the family. And for the most part, we held Albertine's perspective. But by this point we see that we're going to begin to jump perspectives quite a bit. And not only are we going to jump from one perspective to another, we're also going to be jumping around in time. This is what we call a non-linear narrative. In my class while studying novels, we've looked at other narrative styles. We had the complex frame within a frame story of Heart of Darkness. We had the sort of circularity and irregularity of time within Things Fall Apart. We had our traditional chronological sequential narrative, but with a perspective that was older in Jane Eyre. This story is going to be a little bit more segmented because each chapter seems to tell its own story and doesn't tell them in sequential order, and also doesn't use the same narrator or perspective. We're going to begin to look at events from lots of angles, and we begin to ask the question, well, what is this book actually about? We might have gotten the impression that it was all about the family's reaction to June's death early on, but it clearly isn't at this point. And why this order? As we're going through the book, keep asking that to yourself. Why is this chapter here? Why is this chapter in this particular point in the story? And how does my new knowledge gained in this chapter change and adjust my perspective of all the previous chapters? And perhaps set up expectations for the following chapters. So let's note how this works in chapters 2 and 3. In chapter 1, we had this big vision of a family reunion, a family get-together that comes from the death of one of the family members. And we already talked about how family is really important to the concept of identity and also to the major themes of this book. In our family reunion, we mostly looked at a younger generation, particularly through the eyes of Albertine. It's her aunt that's dead. And in that chapter, she looks back at her grandparents, as well as her mother and her uncles and aunts and all of that. The grandparents tell comic stories about Aunt June, like the time that she almost got hanged by her brothers. And it talks about old Grandpa Cashball's senility, how he doesn't remember anything anymore except for numbers and dates. And you get this sort of, grandparently vibe from the two of them. But a lot of that is modified and adjusted by the time we get to chapters 2 and 3, because suddenly we've flashed back to Grandma Marie's childhood, and how she decided to become a saint and go up to the convent, and how she had this epic struggle against this nun. There's a sort of a sense of comedy to what was unfolding there. This power struggle between these two forces. Very different from the previous chapter. And then we see the younger Grandpa Cashpaw, and how he fell for Marie. And we get a new perspective on these grandparently figures. There are times when a grandparent figure sort of fits a role that can't really be changed in our minds. But what happens when we see our grandparents as young people, no longer those sort of established figures? We see them instead in their wild days, perhaps, or with their youthful ambitions. How does that change the way we feel about them and the way we look at them? Do our understandings of the grandmother and the grandfather in chapters 2 and 3 change our feelings about chapter 1? Do we like them better or less? There's a great story about how my grandmother met my grandfather, and I always love to hear about it because it's such a funny story. It's a youthful story. My granddad was dating somebody else, and he and his friends decided to go swimming. And because Granddad's close friend was dating Grandma's sister, they invited her along. Anyway, they decided to go mixed bathing, or swimming. But the thing was, my grandma couldn't swim. So they were supposed to swim out to this dock out in the lake, and so her brother said that he could carry her on his back. But he gave out halfway there, and she started to sink, and she said, well, I guess I'm just gonna drown. And then my granddad dove in and rescued her. So the very first time she met my granddad, he saved her from drowning. And then he was no longer interested in the young lady he had brought, and instead he started dating my grandma. In any case, I think it's well worth understanding the lives of your parents and grandparents and the people who come before you, and understanding that they're more than these established figures in old age. Don't forget to keep looking at that religious symbolism. Obviously there's a lot of that here as well, especially in chapter 2. Keep paying attention to identity, symbolism, and also understanding the order of narrative. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.